Don't be feeling blue, no, no. Shine your light all around, like I know you can do, baby. Yeah, I know you can do. Now some people call me. Welcome, my friends, to the Sage Quay Radio Hour, your home for free and critical thinking, and I'm your host, Mike Williams. Tonight, my very special guest is Robert Bonomo. Robert is a filmmaker, blogger, novelist, and an expert in the esoteric. In this show, we discuss Robert's brilliant video, The 21 Faces of God, and how the tarot deck is a path to understanding both our physical and spiritual development. And so, without further ado, here's Robert. Well, folks, we have a great show this evening. My guest is Robert Bonomo, and Robert has put out a great documentary. It's one that I thoroughly enjoyed watching. It's The 21 Faces of God, and it's about the tarot deck. And we're going to get into that and to understand a little bit more about tarot and what it means. And Robert, maybe we can talk a little bit about how it links into perhaps the mysteries, or I know some folks try to even tie it into the Kabbalah. Maybe we can kind of talk about that a little bit. But to get started, Robert, I was wondering if you could just take us through your path in life, where you started and how it has taken you to do the things that you're doing today.
Actually, I think I had kind of I wasn't one of those weird kids. I was kind of just a normal kid. I like played basketball and just a normal kid. But I think one of the key things that happened to me when I was about 16, I took a bunch of mushrooms and I just had one of those just wild, really deeply spiritual experiences, but profoundly, it really moved me. And I think that changed my life because then, like many people, I was raised in a very religious family, very Catholic family, but I kind of gave that up, became an atheist. But I always remembered that experience. So I wound up in Zen. I was very interested, and I still really love the Buddhist model of life. But then once, I guess I was maybe 30, I was living in Madrid. I was in this Zen group with someone with a lot of lineage, a very serious Zen teacher who had lineage all the way back through to Japan from a very serious school. And I was meditating, looking at the wall, and I remember thinking, I'm in Madrid with a bald French Buddhist guru speaking in Japanese. And I remember thinking, no, and I loved her. She was great, but, there's got to be an easier way. and it wasn't long after that I kind of encountered the tarot. And then, but I just played with it. I wasn't really serious about it. And I've written novels, so I've always had this urge to write kind of a creative life. So I was setting up a novel, and I thought, I need structure in this novel. Let's use the 22 major arcana of the tarot. Each chapter is one of the cards. And I thought it would be easy. I could just kind of play with it. But the deeper I got into the tarot, the more I realized there's a lot here. Yep. And not just each one of the cards, but the path. I had to get into astrology. So it sort of the tarot pushed me into the Western esoteric tradition. Alchemy, astrology. I actually really went deep into astrology also. So that's kind of how I got to be so focused on the tarot. And one thing, there's an article I wrote recently on my website, but I don't think the tarot has ever gotten the respect it really deserves. Because there's a lot of cookbookish things out there about the tarot, how to read the cards, but what they actually mean, and not just the archetypes themselves, but the path. And like we were just talking about before, a lot of people focus on this to the Kabbalah.
Yep.
I spent months trying to follow that Golden Dawn system of the major arcana going through the Sephiroth, the paths, because there's 22 paths in the Sephiroth. And there are 22 major arcana, and there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet.
Right.
And so many people have made that connection, and it never worked for me. Literally months it just didn't click. And then I really searched for a different path in one of the novels I wrote, Your Love and Complete. And it started to come together. And that's why I wanted to make a documentary focusing on really the Western tradition in the tarot, not the Kabbalah system, because I don't think it works. At least for me, it just never clicked.
Do you think it was because of the 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet and the 22 cards of the tarot deck?
I'm absolutely sure of that, because I think a lot of people saw that connection. And remember, it's not just the alphabet. It's the connections in the Sephiroth.
Yes.
It's a beautiful system. The Kabbalistic system is beautiful. And when you see those connections, you think, God, wouldn't this be beautiful if the cards came from that? So I really understand it. And I think, sure, some people have made very good arguments for that. But I always go back to Gershom Scholem. Gershom Scholem was a fascinating guy, and a real scholar. And he was adamant. So there is no connection. But what I always found interesting about what he said was he really felt a connection to the Cathars in the Kabbalah.
Yes.
That the influence from the Cathars, he really thought there was a connection. And Stefan Heller from Gnosis.org? Real fascinating guy.
I've heard of him, yes.
Fascinating guy, one of those old theosophical guys. He knew he's got to be in his 80s.
Yep.
He said he cornered Gershom Scholem once at a conference, and he said, come on, man, it's got to be. And Scholem said, no, it's just not there. But through the Cathars, there is. So I'm not saying, I think the Kabbalah is a fabulous system, but it's not the tarot. That's at least my feeling.
Actually, the Kabbalah gets a bad rap also. Did you want to comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's just completely unwarranted. I mean, all religions, the Muslim religion, the Christian religion, the Jewish religion has the exoteric and the esoteric. You see those currents.
Yes.
And the Kabbalah is the esoteric, the deeper, no? You see it in the Muslim, in Sufis, the Sufism. You see the same thing. The thing is, the Christian esoteric movement, now it's very important to understand the Cathars because you want to just go through quickly who they were. No, they were a Gnostic sect that emerged really pretty late. I don't want to mess up the dates here, but just call it around the 11th century. They emerged in Europe and became very powerful in northern Italy and all through southern France and a little bit into Spain. And the church was really worried. And they tried to send many orders to convert them, and they couldn't. And then finally, there was a crusade, the Albigensian Crusade. A lot of people don't know this. There was one crusade in Europe against Christians, and hundreds of thousands of them were murdered, burned alive. When that happened, I really think that the esoteric Christian movement went underground and emerges in things like the tarot, alchemy, astrology, and in the Kabbalah.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah.
I think a lot of that gets pushed. And just one interesting note, I was a history major. And when I was in high school, I did what they call the AP history and all this. I never studied the Cathars. I was in Russia, and a friend of mine who's a history professor, he says, you don't know who the Cathars are in the Albigensian Crusade? And I'm a Catholic, no? Or I was.
Yeah.
I had never heard of them. So a lot of people don't know who the Cathars are. And it's very important. That really represented sort of the Christian esoteric movement.
Okay, very interesting. So where does Gnosticism fit into this then?
Yeah, this is key. So in Alexandrian Egypt, you had an incredible mix of Greek culture. So you had sort of a Greek-speaking culture that brings in Plato, the Pythagorean thought, but side by side with Hermeticism. Now, Hermeticism would be the old Egyptian religion, and you have Judaism all together. And this would be, say, the Golden Age, maybe the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century in Alexandria. Neoplatonism emerges from that area. And what Gnosticism kind of is, it's almost like a Christian. Most scholars seem to think that it didn't have a direct Jewish origin. It was sort of Jewish Christian with Platonism. So that's where you get the idea of the demiurge. So instead of God being this all wonderful kind of Abrahamic figure, he's kind of either a neutral or almost a bad figure. And there's a God above the God. That's very crucial in the Gnostic myth, that this world is imperfect and who rules it is very imperfect. That idea was pretty strong in early Christian thought, but then it was squashed. And Christianity became the Christianity we know today. That Gnostic thought did work itself through into the Middle Ages, and it kind of explodes again in the Cathar thought. Now, one of the best ways to understand, I think, Gnosticism is through Carl Jung. Jung was convinced that there's a connection between Gnosticism and alchemy, that the Gnostic ideas were so arcane that modern Gnosticism was that medieval alchemy. And that was a modern idea in alchemy, and alchemy became the psychological ideas of the 20th century. He saw a thread through that.
How do we define alchemy, Robert? Because there are also different definitions and understandings of what alchemy means. Some will say, lead to gold. Others will say it's a transforming the physical into the spiritual, and so on. So when you talk about alchemy, how do you define it?
So if we look at nature, if from a spiritual standpoint we see the goal of nature is for all conscious beings, and maybe actually the whole universe, to become more conscious, more aware of itself. Think about something opening onto itself and slowly beginning to see who it is. If that's the goal of nature, what alchemy is to accelerate that process. So on the physical plane, you take elements like lead that turn into gold. And on a consciousness plane, it's lower consciousness opening up onto itself, becoming more conscious, more aware. And I try to stay away from, because a lot of people say, oh, well, the physical part is just a metaphor. I don't really think so. Yeah. Those people who were working on the material plane didn't have that clear divide between what was the mental and what was the physical. It was all merged. Remember, this is before astrology and astronomy were separated, before chemistry and alchemy got separated, before religion and philosophy got separated. It was all together. So I think we have to be careful and say, oh, that's just a metaphor. I don't think so. If you've ever done small alchemic sort of experiments, it's amazing as you do the process, something happens to you and something happens to the material. It's a very profound system. But yeah, I would say the main goal is accelerating that force of nature, making it go faster. Okay, very good. Because I've always wondered that myself. Let me ask you this question then. With your documentary, one of the things that I found very, very fascinating was how you took the viewer through the path of the cards. Each card led to the next card. So it wasn't random. It wasn't haphazard. It had rhyme and reason to it. And that's what struck me, that really, really struck a chord with me when I watched that documentary. And I'm going to have, folks, the link in the description box below, also with Robert's website. How did you make that correlation to take those cards sequentially and put them in the order in which it does depict really the cycle, or the, probably not using the right words, but the evolution of a process of a soul developing? Exactly, yeah. I remember when I watched your documentary, you got to a certain point where there was transformation. I think it was the death card, right? And it was at that point, that's really where it resonated with me, because for each card that you went through, I was able to correlate that to a particular part of my life. I was recalling, yes, I remember when I was there. But it also made me think about everybody in general, the masses, and everybody's at a different level. And you know what? I just want to say I really appreciate the way you expressed that, because so few people actually got it that way. That's what I wanted to. That's exactly what I wanted to do. And one thing I would say is we can all kind of identify where we are in the path, but personally, I would say a part of me, emotionally, I'm pretty early on the path. Intellectually, pretty advanced, and maybe spiritually, a little bit advanced. But we're all in different aspects of ourselves, could be in different levels, no? And I like the way you start with the death card, because I think that's a good way, that's a great place to start. If we look at the Hanged Man, because this is kind of an easy way to see it. What is the Hanged Man? So if people are listening, the Hanged Man card, it's just imagine somebody on a cross, but upside down. So they're seeing the world completely upside down. What does that mean? Now remember, everything has different layers of meaning. In medieval Renaissance Italy, those were shame paintings. So if a politician did something corrupt or was cowardly, they would make drawings on the walls of him upside down like that. So that would be where it comes from, the historic point. But what does it mean on a spiritual level? It means that beginning of taking that red pill moment when you say, everything they told me is not only wrong, but it's absolutely opposite. And there's shame. And it's interesting. There's shame in that. I remember for me, it was shameful to say certain things because I was brought up where you didn't say those things. So awakening, there is an element of shame to it, and you have to overcome that shame.
I actually have gone through that too. There is a part when you do start to awaken. First of all, there's this whole process of questioning yourself.
Right.
Right. Am I crazy?
Right.
Right. You go through that whole period. And then I went through a period where I thought to myself, why didn't I see this sooner? Why was I on the hamster wheel? Why was I on that conveyor belt and not see this because it's so obvious? And then you go through the whole process of being ridiculed.
Yeah.
Everybody who goes through the awakening process gets that. The ridicule, friends, family, even people you don't know. If you have a YouTube channel, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Exactly.
Right. And then what happens is you go through the process of getting beyond that, where you're actually very sure about where you're at least to the degree that you know that you're on the right track. Doesn't mean you have everything understood. It just means that you understand everything in the past was a deception and a lie.
Yeah.
And you're at a point now where, okay, I've got that behind me, so now I've got to continue my exploration and my process of discovery. And you really do it without any kind of concern about ridicule and such, because you just put your head down and you know this is what you've got to do. Knowing that you will make mistakes. That's the thing. You will make mistakes. You will walk down paths that will waste your time at some point because it's a rabbit hole that is intentionally put there to distract you. The key is to realize early on that that's what it is, and then shift gears right away and get yourself back on track.
And I think it's great that we started with the Hangman because so many people know that card. If you don't know anything about the tarot, you've probably seen that card, no?
Yeah.
So what card comes after the Hangman? Death. And there is a death. Like you said, friends, family. You say, what are you talking about? Now, I have a lot of friends that say, why do you talk about these things? A part of you dies. That old you dies. And it's a sad moment. No, you have to mourn the loss. And very interesting, the next card is temperance. Now, a lot of people think of temperance as, the temperance movement. You shouldn't drink. But the Renaissance idea of temperance is balance, wine and water, no? These are the 4 cardinal virtues that go back to Plato. So you can think of temperance as, don't do things in excess. But in the waking up process, first you have that kind of shock, no? Then you die. Then it's very common, and this happened to me and happens to many people, you become inflated. I'm sure you've met these people, no? Sort of the recently awakened. They know everything. They have an opinion on everything.
Right.
And, in vulgar language, there's ways of saying this. What happens? That's when you need that temperance. Stay grounded. And in the film, I use the idea when Buddha was enlightened, I use that clip from when Buddha was enlightened, all the temptations come of women and power. And finally, the last thing Mara says is, by whose authority do you know this? That's when the inflated person says, because I am enlightened. But Buddha doesn't say that. Buddha touches the ground, where he came from, because this is who we are. That's where it's so important to stay grounded. And we can just go quickly to the next card. That's sort of one of the keys, no? But then you go to the devil. And what's the devil? He's all those hidden parts of yourself. You've got to see them all. You have that honesty that comes with the devil, because the devil is kind of like the mirror that you look in and you see the darkest, deepest little, we all have those devils. And then the tower. The tower is the collapse of all dogma. It all dies. Everything you believed is gone. And then you're born again, you know? So that's just one example of a couple cards, but it gives you the idea of the path, no? It's a very profound, not just the archetypes, but the order of them. The path is powerful.
Yeah, that's what really, really struck me was the path. And the way I looked at it, Robert, was there was actually a number of ways to look at it. You can look at it from your individual path, your personal growth, whether it be in the physical world or the non-physical, because to me, we have both that we're supposed to be focused on and mastering. And it also spoke to when I look at the world in general, collectively, that the cards also were depicting the stages in which we are going through, what we're watching today.
Yes. A
lot of times I feel like I'm on the outside looking in. I feel almost detached from this reality. You and I were talking a little bit before the show about, what's going on in the world. It's quite remarkable to see what's happening. And we're again, I'll speak for myself. You may agree or may not agree, but I believe that we're in a process now where it's almost as if the reality that we're in is imploding in on itself. It's no longer able to contain what it's been able to contain in the past. So that's the process of transformation. And out of that, I'm hoping that goodness will rise up.
Yeah.
And now I'm not saying it's going to be next week, folks, or a year from now, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. I can make an argument that we're at a point where we are here, those of us that are trying to get the truth out, to set the table for future generations to pass the baton.
Yeah.
And like I said, I don't know what that time period is. It could be 100 years, 200, 300, 400, 500 years. I don't know. But that's what I'm seeing, Robert. I'm seeing not only from an individual perspective where you can map yourself to the cards, but you can also map the reality in general to the cards. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. And it's really interesting to look at it that way, because as I did in the cards, the first 7 cards are more of the material plane. The second 7, like we talked about with the hangman and death, that's more of the psychological, and then finally the spiritual, no? And if you look at it, just take the United States, for example. The chariot is when you completely dominate the material plane. No, the 1950s and the 60s, we had it all. And then with introspection, for example, the 60s was a period where we really, there was a lot of introspection. Things were turned around. People started to question, look inward, not accept. And when that happens, there is a certain amount of decadence. I don't mean decadence in the negative sense of bad things, but the superstructure begins to kind of creak a little bit.
Yeah.
And it almost feels like we're at the tower, where it's just all of a sudden just collapsing. But in the film, I use alchemy to explain the tower. The towers collapse, and then I use that image of Liberty Tower rising. So I completely agree with you, but the tower experience, think about the tower experience in your life, the dark night of the soul. That is really rough.
Yeah.
It's funny. Somebody sent me a comment and they said, well, how do you know when you've had your tower moment, when it all collapses? And I told them, I said, it's kind of like when you're in love. I mean, if you meet a girl or a partner or person or whatever, and you think, am I in love with this person? You're not in love. No. When you know when you're in love.
That's right.
If you've had your tower moment, because it's like getting punched. Everything is just wiped out. Nothing's left. And it's a feeling like free falling without a parachute and just what's going to happen to me. So yeah, it can happen to a country too. And I feel today was all the Kavanaugh hearings, and watching that was almost like a tower moment.
Folks, Robert and I before the show were talking about the whole Kavanaugh Senate hearings, and And the point I had made, Robert, and again, I don't know if you agree with this, but it's a whole process of almost it's tearing down. It's just tearing things down. It's pulling the rungs out on the ladder, and it's reaching a point of decadence and depravity where at some point something has to give. That's my view. I don't know what the timing is, but is a part of me that is watching all this stuff and listening to it and thinking, perhaps this is going on because it has to get more cartoonish and more depraved in order for people to wake up.
It has to get to that point where we lose total respect, all respect. I remember as a kid listening to, Patrick Moynihan, and you could be a Democrat or Republican,
right,
but that guy was smart.
Yep.
He was eloquent. That language he used, there was many great senators, and you listen to them. You listen to the language used today in this hearing on all sides. Our language is actually it's degenerating. The use of the English language. I mean, it's just all collapsing. And the fighting and the screaming and the commentaries, it was sad. But like you said, it has to, it's like a marriage. There has to be a crisis point where they say, you know what? It's time we went our separate ways. And we're in that point where that moment is fast coming very quickly.
In the deck, I should say, you have the Fool. Could you take the audience through what the Fool represents? Because I know when people see tarot cards and they see the Fool, and they don't really understand what it means, but the Fool plays a very important role. Yes?
Absolutely. And the Fool was probably the most difficult card for me to do. Because the film has 5 introductory sections. So an introduction on the origins, what the archetypes are, duality, the structure. So I finished that and I got stuck on the Fool. Who is the Fool? Now remember, the Fool is 0. So there's minor arcana and major arcana. 56 minor, 22 major. But the Fool is 0. And esoterically, 0 is not a number. The Pythagoreans, for example, had no 0.
Right.
0 comes, I believe from the Arabs invented 0. I could be mistaken, but it was used more for accounting. Because for the Greeks, 0, how could you have nothing? It didn't work with so for example, I don't think Plato ever spoke about 0, Pythagoras. So with the Fool is like this liminal figure who begins the journey. He's completely unconscious, but completely innocent. In Zen, they have that saying, Zen mind, beginner's mind. And he begins this journey, and the last card of the deck, the World, is the Fool, completely enlightened. But acts, and Zen would say he'll act exactly the same way as he did as a fool, but now he knows why. So I really found the Fool 2 figures behind the Fool. Parsifal in the Grail legend and the trickster motif of it's beginning that journey with just a completely blank slate. He's neither good nor bad. He's a blank slate.
It's interesting because I do spiritual regression as a hypnotherapist, and I was also able to apply your documentary and the sequence of the cards to a soul's development. So your soul comes in, a new soul comes in, like you said, it's brand new. Everything is in front of it. All the experiences haven't been experienced yet. So now there's going to be this process of learning. There's this whole spiritual connection to it as well. So what I'm saying, folks, is it's not just a physical world connection to the tarot deck and what Robert presents in the documentary, but I also saw it from a spiritual and metaphysical process of development.
100%, exactly. It really is. Well, the first 7 cards are a little bit the material plane, but it's the soul emerging, from that kind of like that Neoplatonic idea. Because the Neoplatonists are very interesting. They often say, so there's a world soul, and we have a connection to it. We're a small part of it. Or are we separate from that world soul? But I think there's a very strong Neoplatonic idea in the cards of It's the soul, just like you said, it's the soul emerging. That's the fool's journey. Yeah.
Yeah, no, so I saw the Fool as a very, very important card. And like I said, folks, I'm a neophyte with this. So I knew what tarot cards were, but I didn't know anything about what tarot cards meant until I watched Robert's documentary. So I'm going to say it again. It's very important if you're interested in this discussion, and I hope you are, that you head down to the description box below and click the link and watch the documentary because it really is superb. The other question I wanted to ask you, Robert, was about Trump. And again, you and I talked a little bit about this before the show started, and you made a very astute observation about his role relative to the tarot cards. Could you take the audience through that?
Yeah, and it was a real insight for me because I was investigating the trickster motif. And there's an academic, Lewis Hyde, who's written a fabulous book. He's a brilliant guy about the trickster. And I was watching a lecture of his, and somebody asked him, is Trump the trickster? And he obviously didn't like Trump, but he said, well, there's many elements of Trump who are the trickster. The trickster motif is a very complex motif, but you see it in all mythologies. This figure who comes in, he's usually over-sexualized, loves to break taboos, and as Jung said it, completely unconscious. So it's not somebody who's coming in, for example, a lot of spiritual teachers will trick you, play games with you, but from a conscious point of view, they're trying to help you. The trickster is just trying to play games with you, but unconsciously he is trying to awaken you. So it's a difficult balance here, but what I'm trying to say is Trump fulfills a lot of the elements of the trickster motif, one of which, very importantly, is unconscious. But they have a knack for places they shouldn't be, for sticking their finger where they shouldn't and causing lots of problems. They always cause chaos, but it's a necessary chaos. It's nature herself kind of saying, this system's not working, and she throws in the trickster.
Now, do you believe that Trump was essentially handed this role? In other words, he was given a script to play this role, or do you believe that he just happens to be the person that landed in that role?
Yeah, I see it. I honestly, this is my intuition. It's completely organic because it's too perfect. Think of the trickster. I like to think of it in a family setting. So imagine you have a suburban kind of middle class family, but there's a lot of hidden secrets. Dad's drinks too much. Mom's taking pills or doing whatever, but nobody talks about it. And one of the young children, kind of the funny, goofy one, at a dinner party, makes a joke about dad's drinking or mom's philandering that goes over kind of, everyone gets nervous, but it gets thrown out there. It gets thrown out. And once it's out there, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. But that kid doesn't really know what he's doing. He just feels the energy.
Yeah.
And Trump's kind of innate narcissism. I mean, if you like him, you don't. The guy's a narcissist. I think we all have to agree on that. Narcissists love energy. They feel it. They love to get that response. And how do you get a response? By touching taboos. Not by giving the standard party line, blah, blah, blah. No, they like the energy.
No, he certainly knows how to do that. He knows how to push buttons and get people riled up on both sides.
Yeah,
right?
Button pushing is key to the trickster. That's his talent.
Now, Robert, you and I are in our 50s. And one of the things that I talk about on the show sometimes is that the amount of change that I have seen since I was a kid until now. And things are very, very different from my perspective. Now, I have had discussions with folks and they will say, well, Mike, that's because when you were a kid, all of this stuff existed before. All this corruption and this deception and lies were all there before, but you just didn't know about it. So, of course, everything just seems grand. But I'm not sure I agree with that, Robert. Granted, yes, I wasn't as knowledgeable as I am today about what goes on in the world. But on the other hand, as you mentioned before, you talked about Pat Moynihan.
Yeah.
And the way Pat spoke and delivered. Whether you agreed with him or not, there was an elegance in the way that people spoke especially people in positions where, like politicians and so on. It was a nice way of speaking. And today, as you also said, that this has pretty much disappeared from the landscape. Am I crazy, or speaking to another person from
the same generation? Yeah.
Yeah, same generation. Has that been your experience too, as far as seeing the rate of change happening as quickly as it's happened downward, or am I just imagining things?
No, I think you're absolutely correct. And one wonderful example of this is go back and watch Kennedy's news conferences. There's a great video on YouTube. You can see the language, the humor, the sort of things that he refers to culturally. And there's his, when he won the Democratic nomination, he gave a speech that today you couldn't give because people wouldn't understand what he was talking about. The vocabulary, the references. You listen to that and you say, there is a decadence. And what you said, that people say, oh, well, you didn't see it. It's always been going on. I've lived in China. And I still teach Chinese students, no, adults. I taught at a university. I was a university lecturer. I still teach sometimes in China. In China, it's the opposite. They're like that moment when we were young, because everything is, there's a structure, there's an order. It's like entropy, no? You build up the order, and then eventually, what's that, the third law of thermodynamics? It's either grows, it takes a lot of energy to create that order, and eventually it collapses. You see that in China, that people are focused on building things, doing things, sacrificing themselves. Remember when we were young, our parents, the stories they tell us about what they did, raising 6 kids in the Bronx, those guys busted their asses, and they didn't complain. They didn't whine. And victim stories, I mean, you hear the victim stories today, and of course there are a lot of them, but when they tell those victim stories, and they never told them like, oh, I was a victim. They said, this happened, and I got through it. It made me stronger. We're at a different moment historically. Something has changed, and it's a cycle. It has to happen.
Yeah.
It's a natural cycle.
It's interesting because going back to when you and I were younger, the 60s and the 70s, and it almost seemed it was very much more adult, like as far as the interaction, like you said, the way people spoke to each other. And don't get me wrong, there were people that were knuckleheads, so I'm not saying everybody was. Everybody was there, but you chose Kennedy, which I thought was a great example because his speeches were very eloquent. Most of the presidents, up until probably the last few that we've had in office, I have seen a degradation. In fact, I did listen to some of what Trump was talking about at the UN, and it was very childlike.
Yeah.
It doesn't come across as, and I'm going to get a lot of hate mail for this because there's the Trump cult out there. He just doesn't sound very bright, regardless of how they try to pump him up as far as being this developer and all the money he's made and he's, reality TV star and all that stuff. Look, folks, I get all that. What I'm saying is the way he communicates, it's very childlike. And when I watch him, I flash back to a JFK as an example, Robert.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's a big difference. I don't care what anybody says. If I laid up 2 speeches by Trump and then one with JFK, and I gave you a little quiz and I said, like, who is the adult here? Who's got more intellect? I would hope most people would say that JFK is the guy that, is the adult and has more intellect.
I mean, when I was a kid, my father on Sunday mornings, we would watch Firing Line, and you'd see William Buckley talking to Patrick Moynihan for an hour, and they would never like yell at each other or argue. It was a discussion,
right.
And it could get pretty. I remember my father used to say, "What the hell is that word?" No, I mean, there was a lot of really, they stimulated your mind. And you know what's fascinating about Trump? If you go back and watch his videos of him speaking in the 80s, his language has changed enormously. And I think that he knows he's like a great direct marketer. He knows what language gets the best reaction.
Yeah.
And I think he actually he watches what's popular. He imitates it. He tests the reaction. He's like a direct marketer. What works? Let's A/B test it. his language has got to the point where, I mean, I know bad bartenders who use more complex sentences than Donald Trump. Bad bartenders. Don't forget the good ones. But you know what I mean? But I think it's conscious. In his case, I think he consciously does that because that's what works.
You could be very, very right because he plays to the audience. He measures the audience.
Wow. But he's a genius with that. And his Twitter feeds, you know, the more I look at his Twitter feed, the more I think this guy is brilliant. Because the way he just he pushes to the edge, and then he comes a little bit back and then a little bit more. I mean, it's unnerving. It's uncanny how he plays the media, the public. The guy's scary.
You know, that really says something about the society and the culture too, right? Because in order to resonate with them, he's got to do those types of things. In other words, he's got to dumb down the message to a certain degree, speak a certain way, bombard the social media with tweets, as an example. Again, it gets to be a little depressing because what he's doing is he's playing to the quote unquote constituency.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
So what does that say about the constituency? What does it say about where they're at? You know, so again, it gets very disheartening sometimes, Robert. And I'm not trying to make this a negative show, folks. It's just that I got on this thread because it goes back to what I said before. I'm seeing this thing kind of imploding on itself. It's getting more cartoonish. It's as if we live in a cartoon. It's like a clown show. There are those of us and many who are listening to the show are watching this and feeling the same way. So I guess I'm trying to figure out where does it go from here, you know? I don't know where it goes from here, to be honest with you. Like I said, I don't know what the timelines are, Robert, but do you ever think ahead into the future, let's say 5 or 10 years from now? Do you think it's going to get any better, or do you see this continuing in a downward spiral and at some point, you know, it's going to hit the ground, explode, and then it's going to come up? I don't even know if you have any thoughts on that, but.
Oh, yeah, I really do. And I just want to say, because I know we've gotten to kind of the depressing point, but I just made a film. Now, you've watched the film, and the music I use, the films I use, the images I use, this is not pop culture. And I was a little bit nervous that the reaction has been fabulous. I get letters from people.
Yep.
And look at these, like your podcast. And there are many podcasts like this. Two people having an intelligent conversation for 2 or 3 hours. People flock to it. So as one side dies, something's dying, but the other thing is already emerging. This film for me has really, really been a positive because I see that people will sit down and spend 2 hours and 40 minutes watching a film. You know, this is not MTV. And they really react positively to it. So, and think of all of the podcasts, your podcast, and there are many of them, where people have, so something else is emerging, and that is very heartening. How many people began to wake up in 9/11, and by the financial crisis, I mean, so many people by 2008 said, I've had it.
Yep.
That part is really, really, really heartening. And when we get too negative, don't forget that whole side of it, because there's so many great people out there saying really interesting things. So yeah, there's a bad side. And remember, what's dying used to work. It played its role.
Yeah.
We can't say, oh, it was all evil. It was, conspiracies, the archons. No, it played a role. It did something, but now it's got to die. And death is not, it's not pleasant.
Now, you just mentioned the archons. So how would you define the archons? Some would say the archons are an unseen force, like a mind parasite. And then others would say that the archons are actually, they've incarnated. They're actually people among us, most likely in positions of power. How would you describe the archons from your perspective?
Yeah, this is extremely important. And in the kind of world we move in, there's a real tendency toward conspiracy, which is good. I think it's very good. The conspiratorial mind is positive, but we mustn't forget that mythology is the best definition of mythology is what never was, but always is. Conspiracy theories in general are mythologies. They're true, but maybe they didn't happen. The same with the archons. A lot of people want to say, oh, well, he's an archon and these are the people moving the chains. I don't think that's what the mythology of the archon is. The archon is of those, it's the structure itself. So in Gnostic thought, the archons are what control the world from the demiurge. But is there really a demiurge? Is there a guy like on Saturn who's ruling this world, and then there's another guy on, I don't know, a star who's ruling him? No, probably not. It's a myth. No, it's a myth. And we have to remember that. So yeah, the archons are those forces, cultural forces in the world, or the forces of consciousness that push us toward materialism, the material, our desires. Right. That part of the physical, because we all are archons, and we have archons in us, and we need them. Imagine a world without archons. We'd all be sitting, smoking dope and watching the sunset. Someone's got to, plant the wheat, right?
Yeah. Well, you have to have the duality. That's what I explain to people. You have to have the duality. Now, Robert, you mentioned 9/11 and. What was your moment when you became awakened to the depth of what's going on today? Was there a turning point where you said, you know what, something very, very strange is going on here, and I've got to look at it some more, and you abandoned your past and moved forward on the road you're on today? Was there an event that took place that made you do that?
Yeah, I've always been kind of not an early adopter, a late adopter. So I know a lot of people said they woke up on September 11th and they knew it was a conspiracy. Not me. I watched it. I have a lot of connections to New York. Yeah. And, family and things like that. So for me, I went with the mainstream sort of look for a long time.
I did too. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I was not one of but very slowly, but I guess I started like many of your listeners, I started watching a lot of these documentaries like, do you remember there was Loose Change and these sorts of documentaries?
Right.
And I remember I have a cousin, and he said, you got to watch this Loose Change thing. And I was like, oh, my crazy cousin. But then I watched it and I go, you know what? He's onto something. And for me, the key moment was Ali Muhammad. When I started looking at who Ali Muhammad was, I said, this is starting to look like a duck and quack like a duck and waddle like a duck. There's something here. I am completely agnostic on 9/11. I have no theory that I'm married to.
Yep.
But something strange happened. Now, maybe it's pure mythology, that there's a truth there, but the truth doesn't always fit to the actual events. But the truth of the mythology is truer than the events. That's a complex thing for some people that they think about it as a Christian who says, Jesus was a man. He was crucified, died, and was buried. And on the third day, he rose. That man rose. If all of your faith is based on that, what if I can disprove it? What happens to your faith? But a lot of people come back to that Christian idea, and it's a cosmic Christ. It's a mythological Christ. That's truer. When you get there, it's fascinating because I remember I used to believe the Apostles' Creed, right? And I was very religious. Then I got completely away from it. And now I come back to it, and Christ is more real for me now than he was then. That you have to make that leap.
So are you referring to like the Christ consciousness?
Right, that transcendence of duality, the duality of the cross.
Okay.
The material, the eternal, and the Christ figure as transcending that.
Okay.
that transcendent figure. It's almost alchemy, no? It's
Yeah.
the philosopher's stone that transcends that and pushes our awareness forward.
So what's the mythology then, if you had to give an example of 9/11? So you said that, you're not tied to any particular theory. And by the way, people have been debating it now for 17 years. So it goes on in the truth community. They're still throwing rocks at each other. So what would an example of mythology be with regard to 9/11? Setting aside the actual event itself, how would you describe that?
Think about world events, like, for example, the Second World War. When we were raised in that generation where, at least in my case, it was my father and my uncles, all fought in the Second World War. So these men were heroes. That was the most epic event in history, and they were all great men. As I got older and began to study history, I went, well, did we really win the war, or did the Soviets win the war? No? And what actually was the final result of the Soviets winning the Second World War, and was it really worth it? So you begin to look at history and say, a lot of guys in a lot of banks made an unbelievable amount of money, for example, in the First World War.
Right.
And bankers pushed that war forward, so it went on longer, so they could make fortunes. So there are certain mechanisms that move history, and what they say history was really isn't. And there are people, organizations that are taking advantage of these horrible events. That's the mythology of 9/11. They show us one thing. They show us this. They give us a narrative that really affects us, that really pulls at us. But behind that narrative, there's a different truth. That's the truth of the truther movement. And if people understand that, it doesn't matter if it was how the buildings fell, or that's not so important. The truth of the truth movement is the people who push the buttons, who push history forward, often have very nefarious motives. Very. And that we're suckers. We've been hoodwinked. We've been conned into giving our lives, fortunes, and honor to something that's completely dishonorable.
Yeah, that's a very good point, where people in the truth community and the alternative research community in particular, where they are debating details and they're down in the weeds and they're not seeing the bigger picture, is what I think you're saying. They're not pulling the curtain aside, and they may say they are. Oh, I know that there are people making money and all that stuff, but the thing is, you have to pull that curtain aside, and it's not good enough just to know that there are people making money and doing nefarious things. Even look beyond that too, right? Because there are layers to this thing.
Yeah, many.
Most people, though, even though they will say that they're looking beyond the first layer, really major on the first layer, which is, the first entry level into this thing. And they stick with it and they keep riding it and riding it and riding it. In the meantime, all they're doing is debating. And at the end of the day, that's not going to get you anywhere. You're not going to get very far debating, So that's something myself personally, Robert, that I have worked very hard to try not to do, which is to get caught up in the weeds. I try to recognize something for what it is and then push beyond that. And I've also been working very hard in recent shows to try to get more and more people to realize that it's not just about majoring in the physical aspects of this world. You have to spend the time in nurturing and developing the spiritual and the metaphysical aspects of your existence. This is very, very important. And the analogy that I use, and there are those that have heard this before listening to the shows, is that the football field is 100 yards. So let's just say the first 50 yards is the physical piece of it, and then the second 50 yards is the spiritual. Many, many people are playing football only on the first 50 yards.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do you know? Because of the dogma. So it's almost like two very advanced religious, spiritual people from completely different traditions. Imagine someone from the Jewish tradition and from the Christian religion. If they're very advanced, they're not really interested in the particular theology or dogmatic. It's not so interesting. They're not going to argue about that. They're going to talk about their spirituality and the spiritual path. And they don't really care that one came from one tradition and maybe his mythology is different than my mythology. It's not important. But when you go down the rung, then you get people fighting about, Jesus this and Muhammad that. It's not important. And you see that in the 9/11 movement. When people start screaming at each other about if it was thermite or if there was no plane, or it's really not that important.
Yeah.
You agree. Remember, what you agree on is the truth of the story. Don't get lost in the weeds.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Now, Robert, you, I was listening to another show that you did, and you have a finance background. Were you
a little
in the
bit
financial world?
I worked in marketing in a bank, so I wasn't in the finance department. I was in the marketing side of it. But yeah, I was doing the marketing for loans. No, the advertising marketing, the direct marketing of loans. So I had a pretty good idea of what it cost to, and from a marketing standpoint, to acquire a loan.
So where I was going with that is that one of the discussion points that Robert and I had, folks, before the show started was we were talking about the fact that there are a lot of aspects of this matrix that continue to plow ahead unscathed. Nobody puts a finger on it. I'm talking about people who are in quote unquote power or in authority that are claiming to make life better and change things in a positive way. Some of these entities, like the banks, central banks, Federal Reserve, Goldman Sachs, they seem, Robert, to chug along. Doesn't seem like anybody's interested in going after them.
No, yeah. Take for example, Trump. He'll say anything, but you never hear him rail against modern banking. He knows who daddy is.
Yeah.
And he never goes. And one of the fastest and quickest ways to wake up is to understand the financial system. That's where you really see the archons at work, really at work. And I can give you an example. In the summer of 2008, this is July of 2008, all economists agree the world economy was in a major recession. Yet, the price of oil reached an all-time high. I think it was $140 in July of 2008. How did that happen? So how can you have a world economy that's in a major recession and oil hitting its all-time high? It doesn't make any sense. The U.S. Congress, the Congress did, they had a committee investigating this. And even the Congress said, the average barrel of oil was sold 80 times from the time it was pumped out of the ground till it reached the refinery. So all of this financial chicanery that they do never gets talked about. Because if people understood what was going on in the financial world, in the banking system, in commodities, how money's created, you immediately wake up to that whole myth that you've bought into since you were a kid. Go to college, get $100,000 in debt, buy a house, get another $300,000 in debt, work for some corporation for 40 years, make $150,000. You are a winner. You did it. Now go play golf, sell everything, go play golf for another 20 years, spend $1 million, God knows how much money on healthcare, and then die. What have you done with your life? You fed the archons. You're a slave. When you understand that, it really pushes you. It's almost alchemy. It pushes you forward.
It does push you forward, and you're on a very good point. And this is something that I've discussed on shows too, where debt, as an example, is really their ace up their sleeve. They just, every which way from Sunday, they want to impose debt. And, they've started with college students with the credit cards, right? That's one way. And then also the student loans and so on. And so, as you said, you walk out of college and you've got your degree and you owe $50, $75, maybe $100,000 in debt. And then you're going to go get a job someplace, and the income you're going to make is going to, 40% of it's going to go to taxes. And then you're going to take some of that money and you're going to pay back the $75,000 or the $100,000 in debt. And before you know it, your nose, your nostrils are right above the waterline, if not dipping below the waterline periodically, and some people are completely below. It is a masterpiece that the archons really have put in place. I mean, it's brilliant in a very wicked, evil way. People chase money. It's all about money. It's like a spell.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they're chasing it, and their whole life revolves around making money, buying stuff, consumerism, paying off debt. When you're in that mode, you are not thriving. You're not thriving. You're in base survival mode at some point, right? And for those that are not, let's just say there are those that excel in the matrix. They make a lot of money, but they've excelled in a reality that is artificial and so detached from what their true existence was supposed to be.
It's absolutely true. Joseph Campbell had a great line about that. He said, be careful because you might get to the top of the ladder and realize the ladder's against the wrong wall. It's a great way of putting it, no? That be very careful. Now, I'm no spiritual guru. I was totally in that. I worked in advertising. So I lived in New York. I had an apartment in Manhattan, money, girls, whatever, fun. I loved it. But, there comes a point where there's sort of an angst. You think, is this really it? And that angst grows. And then sometimes the universe will give you a big kick in the butt. And you wind up flat on your face. You think it's all over. And then you begin to see something else, the spiritual side of life. So I don't condemn people in their 20s who want to, get married and buy a house and have a car and have a family. That's great. That's what you should do. But, when you're in your 30s, you should start to think about it. And when you hit your 40s, that's when, there are stages of life.
Yes.
Do we really want to live in a world where all the 20-year-olds kind of give up on the material world and just spend all day meditating? No, probably not. The world's got to go forward. Nature's got to push us forward, no?
Yeah.
I mean, we are humans. In India, they have the tradition of the sadhus, no? You reach 50, your kids are grown, you go out in the forest, and you look for the other side of life. I mean, we're both in our 50s. I bet when we were 25, we were probably doing other things. No?
Oh, yeah. No.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah, I wasn't sitting on top of a mountain as a guru.
Yeah, neither was I.
In a robe, I can tell you that right now.
Long way from that mountain I was.
No, I woke up. I had a moment when I was 47 when I got a big slap in the face. That's when it shifted for me. That's when I realized that the road I was on was a road to nowhere. It wasn't going to amount to anything. Prior to that, I can't even say that I even thought about the road leading anywhere. That's even worse, And my point about, and I agree with you, you have to live your life. You're in this matrix, and there are things that you have to do because you have to survive the matrix. You've got to make money. You're not going to get by just meditating. Some people might argue with me that, yes, you can, Mike. Look, I don't think you can, all right? But my point being is if you're in the matrix, you have to stay away from as many of their traps as possible. So even if you're 20 and you're buying a home and stuff like that and getting a car loan and going to school, do it smartly. That's the thing. Keep your wits about you. Don't dive into the pool with no water. And this is what a lot of young people have done. And it's because of the conditioning. It's because, that's exactly what the matrix, the controllers want you to do. They want you to dive headfirst into that pool and there's no water. And then you're going to hit it, the bottom of the pool. It's going to be, well, that really hurt. So if you do it smartly and you have some foresight and think into the future, it's very important that young folks do this. And I'm saying this because I probably wasn't very good at it. I mean, I'm looking back at it now in retrospect. Now, my daughter, she's in her 30s, Robert, and I spent a lot of time telling her about my mistakes and trying to give her a heads up about where I tripped up, hoping that I can maybe get her to see things just a little differently than I did and to progress her awakening sooner than mine. That's what I was trying to do with my daughter. I think that I have succeeded. She's very awake. That's my message to the young people. So I agree with Robert that, you have to go through this life and you're going to go do things and you're going to get married and all that, but just try to do it as smartly as possible so that you don't wind up getting yourself burned or finding yourself in a bad place or a very difficult place when you're 50, 60, 70 years old, because then it gets to be very, very challenging.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and there is a point where you can't go back. No.
Right. That's right.
And so for young people, yeah, I would just say be extremely careful with debt. You can use debt intelligently, but intelligently used debt means you can sell your assets and get out of it.
Right.
Don't ever get in debt to a point where you don't have an escape strategy, that you're underwater. No, so just be very careful with debt and be very careful with dogma.
Yeah. Yeah. Dogma especially. That's right. Now, Robert, one of the questions I meant to ask you, to circle back to the documentary, I forgot to ask you this. It is almost 3 hours long. It's again, folks, it's exceptional. How long did it take you to put that documentary together? Because I had to imagine it was an enormous amount of time.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that, because the fact that, you think, because it took about 3 years. So I would say 1 year was not actually working on it. It was creating files for each of the sections and then looking for music, paintings, quotes, film clips. So I had most of it kind of set up. And then it took 2 years to actually go part by part. There's 27 parts, so you can watch it as a whole film or in sections. About 2 years. And I mean 2 years, like every day, a couple hours. And there were those days where, more.
Okay. Now, it's very obvious that you put a lot of work into it. It's very well done. And I have been a big fan, and I have been promoting it as much as I possibly can, because I think it is very, very important for folks to watch that documentary, because if you watch it and you take it in and you think about what's being presented, it's going to fill in a lot of blanks. It's going to connect a lot of dots. It did for me. And like I said, I was no tarot card expert, and I'm still not, but it did connect a lot of dots for me. So now, Robert, you have been very generous with your time. And so before we head out, is there anything else that you wanted to talk to the audience about? Anything else that you want to fill them in on?
Yeah, one thing I would like to say is it's very interesting, because your reaction to the film as a non-tarot person, but somebody who's interested in spirituality, it's very interesting. That has been the best reaction to the film. So many people have said, I've had this idea of a path in life. I watched your film and I saw, wow, it's in the tarot. So this film is not focused on people who are you don't have to be familiar with the tarot at all, because it's really, and you'll see how alchemy, astrology, all these things connect in. So yeah, it's not, you don't have to be a tarot fanatic to like the film. If you're interested in spirituality, the Western esoteric tradition, it'll have a lot there for you.
Yeah, like I said, I applied it to three things. I applied it to my actual physical life and my learning experience here. I applied it to the spiritual aspects that I focus on, and also the big picture, which is the collective, and the cycle that the collective itself is going through. It covers a lot of bases. Now, Robert, where can folks catch up with your work? Websites, YouTube, your books, as an example?
Yeah, so if you want to watch the film, the easiest way to get there is just go to YouTube, put in the 21 Faces of God, and it'll come up. So you'll see a playlist that has it in a serialized version, and then you'll have the long form version. And then you have some podcasts and stuff I did. So you can find that all there on YouTube. My articles, I have lots of articles published in many places. That can be on my website, thecactusland.com. And my 3 novels are free. Everything I've got is free. So, is on Smashwords. So just go to Smashwords, put Robert Bonomo, and you'll see I have 3 novels, and you can dive into those. If you're interested in the tarot, Your Loving Complete is probably the best one. And if you like dystopia, Cactus Land is very dystopian and interesting in that way.
Now, do you do readings?
I'm not a tarot reader it's not how I make a living. And I'm pretty particular about I don't do health readings, and I don't do general readings. So if someone calls me and says, oh, give me a tarot reading, but if you have a really serious dilemma and it's a deep hard dilemma and you've looked, you've studied, you've investigated, and you're still stuck, yeah, then shoot me an email, and on occasion I do readings for folks.
Okay, I was going to ask you that because some folks will go to websites and do tarot card readings just on a whim. Clearly, that's not what it's intended for. So your perspective on this is that if you have a very challenging issue in your life and you've exhausted many avenues to try to resolve that conflict or whatever it is that you're trying to figure out, then it's appropriate.
And especially if it's a conflict. And just like you said, the first place you go should not be the tarot.
Yeah.
It should be the last place and not just the tarot, any kind of divination, the I Ching. I even think astrology, just using astrology for fun. No, but if you go for an astrological reading because you are just confused and you've spent a long time with that dilemma, it really does work much better.
Okay. Well, that's very good advice. So, thank you so much for that, because I'm sure folks were wondering and asking. So, Robert, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. It has been an absolute pleasure. Like I said, it's like a broken record. I learned so much from the documentary. I've learned so much just from talking with you. And you have an open invite to come back anytime, because I know that we could talk about a lot of stuff. It doesn't have to be the tarot cards. You're very, very awake, and you know what's going on in the world, so we can have some pretty good discussions.
Thanks a lot for having me on and for supporting the film. I really appreciate it, Mike.
Oh, anytime. Well, thank you, Robin. Have a great evening.
You too. Take care, man. Bye-bye.
And that concludes another Sage or Quay interview, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. Links to my guests' websites and social media are listed in the description box below. And as always, I would like to thank everyone for listening and visiting the blog. You can find all my social media and web links by visiting my hub website at sageofquay.com. Also, if you get a moment, please visit laboroflovemusic.com to check out my music and album releases. And remember, live in truth and always serve creation. It's really that simple. See everyone with the next show. Be safe, enjoy, and God bless.
the sky, we're gonna have some fun. Let's change the world, let's do it now. Hey there girl, it's a brand new day. Gonna shake things up and do it our way. Spread your wings and come fly with me. We won't look back because love is so free. Make it real. We're gonna change the world.